I looked down at my worn-out cleaning gloves, then at the scuffed tile floor I'd just mopped for the third time that day, and I felt invisible. To Richard Morrison, the man standing in the hallway of Grandview Estates, Manhattan's most exclusive luxury apartment building, I wasn't a person. I was part of the furniture, something to be ignored or, worse, ridiculed. He thought that by speaking in rapid, pretentious Italian to his associate, he could mock me right to my face without consequence. He thought I was too old, too uneducated, too insignificant to understand. He had no idea that the 67-year-old cleaning woman scrubbing his marble floors had once been Dr. Margaret Chen, a renowned professor of Romance languages at Columbia University. And the words I was about to speak would not only silence him, but unravel the carefully constructed facade of his entire existence. But before we get into the story, please support us by liking and subscribing right now. I also want to say hi. Leave your name, city, and the word present in the comments. I want to know where you're listening from, even in faraway places. The air in Grandview Estates always smelled the same, a mixture of expensive cleaning products, fresh flowers from the lobby arrangements that cost more than my weekly salary, and the faint, unmistakable scent of wealth. For me, Margaret Chen, it mostly smelled like exhaustion and humiliation. I adjusted my cleaning cart, which squeaked loudly no matter how much I oiled the wheels. It was 3:15 p.m. on a Thursday, the time when the building's residents returned from their leisurely lunches and afternoon appointments. My shift had started at 6:01 a.m., and my knees were already screaming. At 67, my body reminded me daily that I wasn't meant for this kind of work anymore. But necessity doesn't care about age or pride. Mrs. Chen! The voice belonged to Donald Pierce, the building supervisor. Pierce was a man who treated his position like he was managing the Pentagon instead of a residential building. He stood near the elevator bank, his arms crossed, his face pinched with perpetual disapproval. Penthouse 4 needs immediate attention. Mr. Morrison spilled wine on the hallway carpet outside his door. He's entertaining important guests. Yes, Mr. Pierce, I said quietly, gathering my supplies. I kept my head down, as I'd learned to do over the past 3 years. Invisibility was safer. I took the service elevator to the penthouse level, my cleaning cart rattling beside me. My reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a woman I sometimes didn't recognize. Gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, deep lines around my eyes, shoulders permanently hunched from years of bending and scrubbing. The expensive silk blouses and tailored pants I once wore to faculty meetings were long gone, replaced by a shapeless blue uniform and orthopedic shoes. When the elevator doors opened, I immediately heard loud voices, laughter, the kind that comes from too much wine and too much confidence. I pushed my cart down the hallway, past framed artwork that cost more than most people's homes, until I reached Penthouse 4. The wine stain was obvious, a dark red splash across the cream-colored carpet. It was fresh, still wet. I knelt down carefully, my joints protesting, and began blotting the stain with a clean cloth. "No, no, no, Antonio," a booming voice said from inside the apartment. The door was slightly ajar. "You don't understand American business culture. These people, they're simple. You smile, you flatter them, you take their money. It's like taking candy from children." That was Richard Morrison. I recognized his voice. He was a real estate developer who'd made headlines recently for buying up historic buildings in Brooklyn and converting them into luxury condos, displacing hundreds of longtime residents in the process. He was new money desperately trying to look like old money. "But Richard," another voice responded, younger, Italian accented, "what about the zoning laws, the community board?" Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Antonio, my friend, let me teach you something about New York. Money talks, and everything else is just noise. We pay off the right people, we make the right donations, and suddenly those pesky regulations disappear. These working-class neighborhoods, they don't matter. Their protests don't matter. They're like the cleaning lady, present but irrelevant." I froze, my hand still on the carpet, present but irrelevant. "Exactly," Antonio said. In Italy, we have the same problem. Too many poor people complaining about progress. They don't understand that we are doing them a favor by improving their neighborhoods, even if they can no longer afford to live there. The door suddenly swung open wider. Richard Morrison stepped into the hallway, holding a crystal glass of wine. He was in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive suit that fit a little too tightly, as if to emphasize the personal trainer sessions he constantly mentioned. He had the kind of face that might have been handsome once, but had hardened into something cruel. He looked down at me kneeling on the floor. His eyes passed over me the way you'd look at a piece of furniture, briefly, without real interest. "Oh, the cleaning woman," he said, not to me, but to Antonio, who had followed him into the hallway. "Perfect timing. Watch this, Antonio. This is what I mean about American workers. No education, no ambition, just going through the motions." Antonio, a younger man in an expensive Italian suit, looked uncomfortable. "Richard, perhaps we should—" No, this is instructive." Richard took a sip of his wine and looked down at me with undisguised contempt. "Tell me, cleaning lady, do you speak any languages besides English? Do you even speak proper English?" I kept my eyes on the carpet, continuing to blot the stain. My heart was pounding, but I forced my hands to remain steady. "I didn't think so," Richard continued. He turned to Antonio and, with a theatrical flourish, switched to Italian. His accent was terrible, the kind of Italian learned from a Rosetta Stone program and a semester abroad in Florence 20 years ago. "Guarda questa vecchia," Richard said, his pronunciation clumsy and aggressive. "È completamente inutile. Probabilmente non sa nemmeno leggere. Queste persone sono come animali, Antonio. Vivono solo per servire persone come noi." He was saying, "Look at this old woman. She's completely useless. She probably can't even read. These people are like animals, Antonio. They only exist to serve people like us." Antonio's face paled. "Richard, that's— what? True?" Richard laughed. "Don't be so politically correct, my friend. She doesn't understand a word we're saying. Watch." Richard leaned down closer to me, invading my personal space. He snapped his fingers near my face as if I were a dog. "Più veloce, stupid Adonna," he said loudly, his breath reeking of expensive wine. "Faster, stupid woman. I'm paying you to clean, not to sit there like a useless lump. Capisce?" The hallway went silent except for the sound of my cloth moving across the carpet. Richard stood there, waiting for his moment of triumph, waiting for me to look up at him with confusion or fear. He wanted me to ask what he'd said, to prove his point that I was as ignorant as he assumed. But something inside me, something I'd kept carefully locked away for 3 years, began to crack open. I thought about the lecture halls at Columbia University, where I'd taught for 30 years. I thought about the research grants, the published papers, the symposiums in Rome and Paris, where I'd presented my work on the evolution of Romance languages. I thought about the respect I'd once commanded, the students who'd called me Dr. Chen with admiration in their voices. And I thought about how I'd lost it all. Friends, every story I tell you is released every day. But YouTube will only show them to you if you tap the red subscribe button. Please do it now while I'm speaking. Tap subscribe, turn on notifications, and you'll never miss a story. Have you done it yet? Thank you. To understand why I, Dr. Margaret Chen, was on my knees scrubbing wine stains for a man like Richard Morrison, you need to understand what happened 3 years ago. You need to understand the fall. I had been living the life I'd worked my entire existence to build. I was 64, approaching retirement, with a pension waiting for me. My husband David had passed away 5 years earlier from cancer, but I'd found peace in my work. My daughter Emily lived in Seattle with her family. Life was good. Life was stable. Then Emily called. "Mom, it's Grandma. She's had a stroke." My mother, Lin Chen, was 89 years old. She'd emigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s, working in garment factories to put me through school. She'd sacrificed everything so I could have the education she never had. When I became the first Asian American woman to receive tenure in Columbia's linguistics department, she'd cried with joy. The stroke had been massive. When I arrived at the hospital in Seattle, the doctor's words were devastating. "She's stable, but she'll need intensive care. The damage is severe. She'll likely need 24-hour monitoring for the rest of her life." My mother had always been independent, proud, strong. Seeing her in that hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to move her right side, broke something in me. "The care facility we recommend costs about $12,000 per month," the social worker told me. "Medicare will cover some of it, but not all, and the waiting list for subsidized facilities is 2 to 3 years. I looked at my mother's face. Even in her paralyzed state, I could see the fear in her eyes. I thought about those garment factories, about her bent back and tired hands, about every sacrifice she'd made for me. There was no decision to make. There was only one choice. I took a leave of absence from Columbia, sold my apartment in Manhattan, and moved to Seattle. I thought I could manage on my pension, but I was wrong. The care facility costs, the medication, the specialized therapy, it devoured everything. Within 6 months, I drained my savings. I tried to return to Columbia, but the university had already hired my replacement. "Budget cuts," they said. "Your position has been eliminated," they said. "We're sorry," they said. I was 65 years old, overqualified for most academic positions, and desperate for income. Universities don't hire 65-year-old adjunct professors when they can get 30-year-olds for half the price. Emily and her husband Tom tried to help, but they had their own children, their own mortgage. I couldn't become their burden. So when my mother's condition stabilized enough for her to be transferred back to New York, where she'd lived most of her life, I followed. I found a care facility in Queens that was good but expensive. And I found the only job that would hire a 65-year-old woman with no recent work experience, cleaning. Grandview Estates hired me because I was willing to work the early morning shift that no one else wanted. I was willing to scrub toilets and mop floors and be invisible. The pay was $18 per hour. If I worked 50 hours a week, I could almost cover the care facility costs, my tiny studio apartment in the Bronx, and rice and vegetables for dinner. I stopped reading academic journals because it hurt too much. I stopped speaking Italian and French and Spanish because there was no one to speak them with. I became what Richard Morrison saw, an old cleaning woman, bent and broken. But I never forgot who I was. Now, kneeling on that carpet in the penthouse hallway, listening to Richard Morrison call me an animal in Italian, something snapped. The careful wall I'd built around my old self crumbled. I slowly stood up. My knees protested, but I ignored them. I looked directly at Richard Morrison. And I spoke. "La sua pronuncia è terribile," I said, my voice clear and cold. My Italian was perfect, the accent flawless, the kind that comes from years of study and summers spent in Tuscany conducting research. "Your pronunciation is terrible." Richard's smug expression froze. The wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Antonio's eyes went wide. I continued, switching to the formal, educated Italian that I'd used at conferences and academic symposiums. "E quanto alle sue opinioni sulle persone della classe operaia," I said, taking a step closer to him, "mi fanno capire che lei è esattamente il tipo di uomo che la mia ricerca ha descritto, ricco di denaro ma povero di carattere, cultura e umanità." Translation. "And as for your opinions about working-class people, they make me understand that you are exactly the type of man my research has described, rich in money but poor in character, culture, and humanity." The color drained from Richard's face, but I wasn't finished. 3 years of silence, 3 years of swallowed pride, 3 years of being treated as invisible, it all came pouring out. Antonio took a step backward, his hand reaching for the doorframe as if he needed support. His eyes darted between Richard and me, his expression shifting from shock to something that looked almost like respect. Richard, however, was turning an alarming shade of red. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He clearly understood enough of what I'd said to know he'd been insulted, but his Italian wasn't good enough to formulate a response in the same language. I switched to English, my voice steady and cold. You called me an animal, Mr. Morrison. You said I probably can't read. You said I exist only to serve people like you. I paused, letting each word land like a hammer. Would you like me to repeat what you said? In Italian? Or perhaps in French, Spanish, Portuguese, or Mandarin? Because I speak all of them fluently. Who the hell do you think you are? Richard sputtered, finally finding his voice. His hand was shaking, wine sloshing in his glass. I'm Dr. Margaret Chen, I said quietly. Or I was, until 3 years ago. I was a professor of Romance languages at Columbia University for 30 years. I published 7 books, including a definitive work on the evolution of Italian dialects that's still used in graduate programs across Europe. I gave lectures at the Sorbonne, at Cambridge, at La Sapienza in Rome. I watched the information slowly penetrate Richard's alcohol-fogged brain. His expression shifted from anger to confusion to something darker, embarrassment mixed with rage. I held a chair in comparative linguistics, I continued. I mentored 43 PhD candidates. I was fluent in 8 languages, and now I clean your floors because my mother had a stroke and someone had to pay for her care. Because that's what you do for family. Something I suspect you wouldn't understand. Antonio spoke for the first time, his voice quiet and respectful. Dr. Chen, I apologize. What Richard said was, "Don't apologize for me," Richard snapped, whirling on Antonio. Then he turned back to me, his face contorted with fury. You think you're better than me because you have some dusty degrees? You think your books and your research make you important? Look at you. You're a cleaning lady. You're on your knees, scrubbing my carpet. By necessity, I said calmly. Not by choice. There's a difference. The only difference is that I'm successful and you're a failure. Richard's voice was rising, echoing down the hallway. You lost everything. Your job, your career, your dignity, and now you're working for me. For me. I looked at him for a long moment. In his eyes, I saw something I recognized from my years of teaching, the desperate insecurity of someone who knows, deep down, that their worth is measured only in money, and that money can disappear. Mr. Morrison, I said softly, success isn't measured by the size of your bank account. It's measured by the content of your character. And yours is severely lacking. Get out, Richard screamed. You're fired. Get your cart and get the hell out of my building. You can't fire her, Antonio said suddenly. Both Richard and I turned to look at him. Antonio's face had hardened. She works for the building, not for you. I own 3 apartments in this building, Richard shouted. I have influence with the board. I'll have her fired by the end of the day. No, a new voice said. You won't. We all turned. Standing at the other end of the hallway was Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the elderly woman from Penthouse 2. She was 82 years old, a widow who'd lived in Grandview Estates for 40 years. She was wearing a silk robe and leaning on a cane, but her eyes were sharp and alert. Mrs. Whitmore, Richard said, his tone immediately shifting to false politeness. I apologize for the disturbance. This cleaning woman was being insubordinate. I heard everything, Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, her voice carrying surprising strength. My door was open. I heard what you said in Italian. I heard how you spoke about this woman, this accomplished scholar. And I heard your tantrum when she revealed your ignorance. Richard's face went from red to white. That's not what happened. I speak Italian too, Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Whitmore said, taking slow, deliberate steps toward us. My late husband was from Milan. We lived there for 15 years. Your accent is atrocious, and your vocabulary is that of a poorly educated teenager. She stopped in front of me, studying my face. Dr. Chen, is it? Yes, ma'am. I thought I recognized you, Mrs. Whitmore said. My granddaughter Rebecca studied linguistics at Columbia. She took your seminar on language and power in 2018. She said you changed her life. I felt tears prick my eyes. Rebecca. I remembered her, a brilliant student with a passion for sociolinguistics. Rebecca Whitmore, I whispered. She wrote a beautiful thesis on code switching in immigrant communities. She's a professor at NYU now, Mrs. Whitmore said proudly. Then she turned to Richard, and her expression became ice cold. Mr. Morrison, I am the board president of Grandview Estates. I've tolerated your presence here because my fellow board members were impressed by your money, but I've always found you vulgar and cruel. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't think... I'm not finished. Her voice cracked like a whip. You have violated our building's code of conduct. We have zero tolerance for harassment of staff. Consider this your formal warning. One more incident, and the board will move to revoke your residency. Richard looked like he'd been slapped. You can't do that. I own these apartments. You lease them, Mr. Morrison. There's a difference. Read your contract. Mrs. Whitmore turned back to me. Dr. Chen, would you do me the honor of joining me for tea tomorrow afternoon? I'd love to hear about your work. I didn't know what to say. My voice came out as a whisper. I'd like that. Mrs. Whitmore nodded and began walking back to her apartment. As she passed Richard, she paused. Money can't buy class, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps you should spend less time insulting elderly women and more time learning that lesson. After she disappeared into her apartment, the hallway fell silent. Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. Antonio had stepped further away from him, as if physical distance might separate him from Richard's disgrace. I remained where I was, my cleaning supplies scattered around my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. For 3 years, I'd kept my head down. For 3 years, I'd accepted the invisibility, the dismissive glances, the casual cruelty. I'd told myself it was temporary, that it was necessary, that my mother's care was worth any sacrifice. But standing there in that penthouse hallway, I realized something had shifted. I'd spoken up, I'd defended myself, and instead of losing everything, I'd found an unexpected ally. Richard finally moved. He drained the rest of his wine in one gulp and slammed the glass down on a nearby console table hard enough that I worried it might shatter. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and venomous. He pointed a finger at me. You think you're smart? You think you've won? I'll have your job by Monday. I'll call the supervisor. I'll call the building management company. I'll make sure you never work in this city again. Richard, stop, Antonio said quietly. You're making it worse. Shut up, Richard whirled on him. Whose side are you on? The side of basic human decency, Antonio replied, his Italian accent thick with disgust. What you said about her, about working-class people, it was shameful. I came to America to do business with you, but I don't think I can work with someone who has so little respect for others. Richard's eyes widened. Antonio represented a major investment opportunity, a connection to European real estate markets. Losing him would cost Richard millions. Antonio, you're overreacting. I was just revealing your true character, Antonio finished. He turned to me and gave a small, respectful bow. Dr. Chen, please accept my sincere apologies. What Richard said was inexcusable. Then he looked at Richard one final time. I'll be returning to Milan tomorrow. Our business is concluded. Antonio walked away, leaving Richard standing alone in the hallway. The silence that followed was suffocating. If you want to know how this story ends and discover many more, hit the red subscribe button. It's free, and it helps me a lot. Richard turned to face me, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Not remorse, but calculation. He was a businessman, and businessmen knew when to cut their losses. Fine, he said coldly. You want to play this game? Let's see how long you last here. I'll make sure every resident in this building knows about this. I'll make sure they request someone else to clean their floors. You'll be begging for shifts by next month. I should have been afraid. 3 years ago, I would have been. But something had changed in me during those few minutes of speaking Italian, of reclaiming my voice. Do what you need to do, Mr. Morrison, I said quietly. But remember this. I've survived worse than you, I've lost more than you can imagine, and I'm still standing." Richard's jaw clenched. Without another word, he turned and stormed back into his apartment, slamming the door so hard the framed artwork on the walls rattled. I stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by my cleaning supplies, my hands shaking from adrenaline. Slowly, I knelt back down and returned to the wine stain on the carpet. My knees protested, my back ached, but I finished the job. Because that's who I was now, someone who finished what they started, no matter how hard it got. When I returned my cart to the service area in the basement, Donald Pierce was waiting for me. His face was flushed, his arms crossed over his chest. "Mrs. Chen," he said tersely, "we need to talk. In my office. Now." My stomach dropped. Richard had already called. I was going to be fired. I followed Pierce into his small, cluttered office. He sat behind his desk and gestured for me to sit in the plastic chair across from him. For a long moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "I got 3 phone calls in the last 20 minutes, Pierce finally said. "One from Mr. Morrison, demanding that you be fired immediately for insubordination. One from Mrs. Whitmore, explaining what actually happened and threatening to go to the management company if any action is taken against you. And one from Antonio Russo, the Italian gentleman who wanted to make sure the building knew that Mr. Morrison had harassed you." Pierce leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "In 17 years of managing this building, I've never had a situation like this." "I'm sorry, Mr. Pierce," I said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, I just defended yourself," Pierce interrupted, "against a bully who thinks his money gives him the right to treat people like garbage." He sighed heavily. "Look, Mrs. Chen, I'm not going to lie to you. Morrison has influence. He's going to make your life difficult. He's going to complain about every little thing. He's probably going to campaign to get you fired." My heart sank. "So I'm being let go?" "No," Pierce said, surprising me. "You're not. Mrs. Whitmore sits on the board of the management company that owns this building. If she says you stay, you stay. But it's going to be uncomfortable. Morrison isn't going to let this go." I nodded slowly. "I understand." Pierce looked at me for a long moment. "Why did you do it? Why risk your job? You could have just ignored him, finished cleaning, and walked away." "Because," I said, my voice steady, "I spent 3 years being invisible. And today, I decided I wasn't going to be invisible anymore, even if it costs me everything." Pierce nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. "Good for you, Mrs. Chen. Someone needed to put Morrison in his place. I'm just glad it wasn't me who had to do it." As I left his office and headed for the service elevator, exhaustion crashed over me like a wave. My shift wasn't over. I still had 3 more floors to clean before I could go home to my studio apartment in the Bronx. But something was different. My steps felt lighter. My shoulders, permanently hunched from years of bending and scrubbing, straightened slightly. I'd spoken up. I'd reclaimed a piece of myself that I thought I'd lost forever. And no matter what Richard Morrison did next, he couldn't take that away from me. The next few days at Grandview Estates were exactly as Pierce had predicted, uncomfortable. Richard Morrison filed a formal complaint with the management company, accusing me of verbal harassment and unprofessional conduct. He demanded a full investigation and my immediate dismissal. But Mrs. Whitmore was true to her word. She not only defended me to the board, but also launched her own investigation into Morrison's behavior. It turned out I wasn't the first staff member he'd mistreated. The previous year, he'd gotten a parking attendant fired for supposedly scratching his car, a claim the security cameras later proved was false. He'd berated a delivery person so severely that the woman had quit on the spot. He'd complained about the building's housekeeping staff at least a dozen times, always in demeaning terms. Mrs. Whitmore compiled everything into a detailed report and presented it at an emergency board meeting. Morrison was given a final warning: one more incident of harassment toward any staff member, and he would be evicted. He didn't like it, but he had no choice. The building's board had spoken. But Richard Morrison was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. If he couldn't get me fired, he would make sure my life was as difficult as possible. Every time I cleaned the penthouse floor, he would accidentally leave wine glasses on the carpet, spill coffee in the hallway, or scatter papers that needed picking up. He would stand in his doorway and watch me work, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. He never spoke directly to me. That would violate Mrs. Whitmore's warning, but he made sure I knew he was there. Other residents noticed the tension. Some avoided making eye contact with me, uncomfortable with the drama. But others, surprisingly, went out of their way to be kind. Mrs. Whitmore invited me to tea, as promised, and we spent a lovely afternoon discussing linguistics, literature, and her granddaughter Rebecca. An elderly gentleman from Penthouse 3, Mr. Samuel Brooks, started leaving me generous tips with notes that said, "Thank you for your excellent work." Still, the situation with Morrison weighed on me. I was living under constant stress, always waiting for the next complaint, the next attempt to get me fired. My sleep became restless. The chronic pain in my knees and back worsened. One evening, 3 weeks after the incident, I was finishing my shift when Pierce called me into his office again. My heart sank. This was it. Morrison had finally convinced someone to let me go. But when I entered the office, Pierce wasn't alone. Mrs. Whitmore was there, sitting in the chair I usually occupied, her cane resting against the desk. Next to her was a younger woman I didn't recognize, professionally dressed, carrying a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Chen," Mrs. Whitmore said warmly, "please, sit down. This is my granddaughter, Rebecca." I froze. Rebecca Whitmore stood up and extended her hand, her face breaking into a wide smile. "Doctor." "Chen, I can't believe it's you. When grandmother told me you were working here, I had to come see for myself." "Rebecca," I whispered, shaking her hand. She looked so grown up now, so confident. "Congratulations on your position at NYU, your grandmother told me." "Thanks to you," Rebecca said, her eyes shining. "Your seminar changed the trajectory of my entire career. You taught me that language isn't just about communication. It's about power, identity, culture. Everything I do now is built on the foundation you gave me." I felt tears welling up. For 3 years, I'd felt like my academic career had been erased, like all those years of teaching and research had vanished into nothing. But here was proof that it mattered, that I'd made a difference. "I asked Rebecca to come today because I have a proposal for you," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Dr. Chen, you shouldn't be cleaning floors. Your mind, your expertise, it's being wasted." "Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate the sentiment," I said quietly. "But I don't have many options. I'm 67 years old. Universities aren't hiring." "Which is exactly why I spoke to the board at NYU," Rebecca interrupted. Her eyes were bright with excitement. "We're launching a new program in our linguistics department, a bridge program for non-traditional students and returning adult learners. We need someone with real-world experience, someone who understands the challenges of starting over, someone who can teach, but also mentor." My heart started beating faster. "Rebecca, what are you saying?" "I'm saying we want to hire you as a senior lecturer and program coordinator," Rebecca said. "It's a 1-year renewable contract with benefits. The salary is $75,000, which I know isn't what you made at Columbia, but it's more than twice what I make now," I whispered. $75,000. With benefits, it would cover my mother's care facility. It would let me leave the studio apartment in the Bronx. It would let me stop destroying my body for $18 an hour. "There's more," Mrs. Whitmore said, leaning forward. "I sit on the board of the Whitmore Foundation. We provide grants for family caregiving. Your situation, caring for your mother, qualifies. We can provide a grant of $3,000 per month to supplement her care facility costs." I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin. I don't understand. Why would you do this for me?" "Because you deserve it," Rebecca said simply. "Because you changed my life, and now I have the power to change yours. Because talent and dedication shouldn't be punished just because life got hard." Mrs. Whitmore reached over and took my hand. Her skin was thin and papery, but her grip was strong. And because, Dr. Chen, I've lived long enough to know that the Richard Morrisons of the world shouldn't win. Men like him measure worth by money and status. But worth is measured by character, by what we give to others, by how we treat people when they can't fight back. You fought back, Rebecca added. Grandmother told me what you said to Morrison, about how success isn't measured by bank accounts, but by character. That took courage. I was crying now, tears streaming down my face. 3 years of exhaustion, humiliation, and pain were pouring out. I accepted the position at NYU. When I gave Pierce my 2 weeks' notice, he actually smiled and shook my hand. Good for you, Mrs. Chen. You deserve better than this place. On my last day at Grandview Estates, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Whitmore organized a small gathering in the building's common room. Just a few residents and staff members who wanted to say goodbye. There was cake, coffee, and kind words. Mr. Brooks gave a short speech about dignity and respect. Even some of the younger residents I'd never spoken to came by to wish me well. Richard Morrison wasn't there, of course, but I saw him once more before I left. I was cleaning the penthouse hallway for the last time when his door opened. He stood there, looking older somehow, smaller. The confidence and arrogance I'd seen 3 weeks ago had faded. So you're leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I replied, continuing to work. To teach at NYU. Yes. A long silence. Then, I didn't know about your mother, about why you were working here. I stopped and looked at him. For the first time, I didn't see cruelty in his eyes, just a kind of empty confusion, as if he couldn't understand how the world had shifted beneath his feet. Would it have mattered? I asked quietly. If you'd known, would you have treated me differently? He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. Richard Morrison saw people as either useful or irrelevant. My circumstances wouldn't have changed his behavior. Only being challenged, only facing consequences, had made him pause. I hope, I said, picking up my supplies, that you learn something from this. That you realize people's worth isn't determined by their job title or their bank account. That everyone you meet has a story, a history, a reason for being where they are. People like you, Richard said, his voice tight. You think you're better than me because you have degrees and awards. But I built an empire. I made something of myself. Yes, I agreed. You built an empire. But what did you build it on? Displaced families? Exploited workers? Cruelty disguised as business acumen? I paused. I spent 30 years teaching students to think critically, to understand other cultures, to use language as a bridge instead of a weapon. And when I lost everything, I didn't lose who I was. Can you say the same? I didn't wait for his response. I walked away, pushing my cleaning cart for the last time, leaving Richard Morrison alone in his expensive penthouse with his expensive wine and his empty success. That was 6 months ago. Now, I stand in front of a lecture hall at NYU, looking out at 40 faces, students ranging from age 22 to 65, from countries around the world, all of them returning to education after life had taken them on unexpected detours. Language, I tell them, is power. It's identity. It's how we define ourselves and how others define us. Some of you have been told you're too old, too uneducated, too different to succeed, but you're here, and that makes you warriors. My mother is thriving in a new care facility, one with specialized neurological therapy. She's regained some movement in her right hand. Last week, she squeezed my fingers and whispered my name, just one word. But it was everything. Rebecca and I are co-authoring a paper on language acquisition in older adults. Mrs. Whitmore attends my lectures when her health permits. My studio apartment in the Bronx has been replaced by a modest but comfortable one-bedroom in Queens, close to my mother's facility. And Richard Morrison? I heard he sold one of his Grandview penthouses and moved to Miami. I don't think about him often, but sometimes, when I'm tired or doubting myself, I remember that hallway. I remember speaking Italian, reclaiming my voice, refusing to be invisible. Because that's the truth they don't tell you. You're never just one thing. You're everything you've ever been, every success, every failure, every moment of courage and fear. And no one, not even someone with all the money in the world, can take that away from you. If you enjoyed this story, click subscribe and tell me in the comments what part impressed you. There's more tomorrow. See you there.